Hi, welcome to Saints and Sinners. I'm so glad to be here with this amazing group of short story writers for the panel Lean and Mean or Short and Sweet, How to Write Compelling Short Fiction. Some writers are devoted, this is a panel description that we're going to be talking about today. Some writers are devoted to the short story as if the form itself summons up their best efforts. Others use it to take a break from the demands of the novel. In this panel, widely published writers discuss the different skill sets and thought processes of meeting the form, as well as the current market for short fiction and assembling the story collection. These talented, diverse authors, Michael Lowenthal, Patrick Earl Ryan, and J.D. Scott, discuss their recent collections and current projects. And I'm Alden Jones. I'll be moderating. I have also published a collection of stories called Unaccompanied Minors, but my role here today is to moderate and talk to these fine writers about their recent books. And I think I will start out with just asking each of you to, well, first I'll introduce you, and then I'll ask each of you to introduce your book. So in alphabetical order, Michael Lowenthal is the author of 4 novels, The Same Embrace, Avoidance, Charity Girl, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and Washington Post Top Fiction of 2007 pick, and The Paternity Test, a Lambda Literary Award finalist. Lowenthal has taught creative writing at Boston College and Hampshire College, and as the Picador Guest Professor for Literature at Leipzig University. Since 2003, he has been a faculty member in the Low Residency MFA program at Lesley University. His new book, published in March 2021, is a short story collection, Sex with Strangers. Patrick Earl Ryan was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, in a family spanning 5 continents and 7 generations in the city. His debut short story collection, If We Were Electric, was chosen by Roxane Gay as the winner of the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction and published in 2020 by the University of Georgia Press. His stories have appeared in Ontario Review, Pleiades, Best New American Voices, Men on Men, Best New Gay Fiction for the Millennium, Cairn, and James White Review. And he was the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the LGBTQ+ literary journal, Lodestar Quarterly. And J.D. Scott is the author of the story collection Moonflower, Nightshade, All the Hours of the Day, and Now Books 2020, and the poetry collection Mask for Mask, New Rivers Press 2021. Scott's writing has appeared in Best Experimental Writing, Best New Poets, Denver Quarterly, Prairie Schooner, Indiana Review, Hayden's Ferry Review, and elsewhere. Scott was a Lambda Literary Fellow and edited the Emerge 2018 Lambda Fellows Anthology. So thank you all for being here. And in that order, why don't you each tell us and flash the cover and tell us a little bit about your books, all of which are within the last year. So congratulations to all of you. And Michael, tell us about your book.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Alden. And I'm just thrilled to be here with Saints and Sinners and with 3 fabulous writers who I admire so much. And this is, my book actually doesn't come out for another week and a half after this is going to go live. So this is actually the very first time in my life talking about this book to anybody. So you can help me along. So the book has this beautiful blue cover. It's called Sex with Strangers. It's got some sexy feet on there for the foot fetishists among you. And it's a collection of 8 stories, and they all deal with how our sort of self-image changes when subject to the forces of desire and attraction and lust. There is sex in the story, but it's not always all that sexy. And there are strangers in the story, but they're not always strangers according to like the conventional definition, although they are sometimes. And I think I deal a lot with yearning and loneliness as much as with sort of ecstatic lust, if you know what I mean. And it's a pretty diverse collection. I would say about 4, depending on how you count, 4 of the 8 stories are queer, sort of in your face queer, and 4 are pretty much straight-ish. And some have female protagonists, some have male protagonists. There's one sort of trans or gender queer character as a main character in a story. And, you know, there's sort of range from a guy going clubbing to a newly ordained priest who's a chaplain on a cruise ship, to a young writer who has some resemblances to me way back when I was a young writer, who's helping to take care of his mentor, who's an erotic writer dying of AIDS. And that was based on John Preston, who some of the folks in this audience might know, who was a great writer and editor who died in the 90s. So I think that's a good overview, and happy to talk about more in detail after.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to see you, and good to be on a panel with everyone else. It's so nice to at least even be a virtual part of Saints and Sinners in my hometown. This is my collection, If We Were Electric. It is 12 stories, which take place, if there is a common thread, it is that they take place all in New Orleans or around New Orleans. And because of that, I think that one of the things that really binds the stories together is, and this is a similarity to Michael's collection, is this idea of desire. So it goes a little bit more broadly in my collection, in that there's this desire to live, there's this desire to, this sounds like it might be the same thing, but a desire to not die, so that fear of death. So there's this strain throughout it of electricity, and that's why I use that for the title, and of the electricity of desire and how that runs through the entire collection. So the stories, they're not linked, they're not the same narrators, but they all have that in common. That sort of, their desires are leading them. And I think that's very common in New Orleans, more so than maybe other places in America. We follow our desires. You know, it tends to be the place where the rest of the South comes to sin a little bit, you know, because the walls are a little bit looser here. So the other thing is, I think that the book can be described very much as queer in both the terms of sexuality. So a good portion of them, maybe 75% in my case, are very queer oriented. And then the others in terms of sexuality. And then the others are kind of outsiders in a very Flannery O'Connor sort of Southern Gothic way. So I think that's a good introduction for mine.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I'm JD Scott. I'm so glad to be amongst you. I have my debut story collection that came out about a year ago, April 2020, Moonflower, Nightshade, All the Hours of the Day. I think it's a little bit like when you're watching Jeopardy and the potpourri category comes up and you're like, it could be anything. And that's some of the stories. There's a wide variety, and they 10 stories, although one is truthfully a novella, and they cover lots of different ground, lots of different genre. I play with genre a lot, so some of the stories are very strictly realist literary fiction, and some are a lot more sort of magical realism. And I think playing with genre is also kind of what the characters are going through. All these characters are on thresholds and going through transformations. So the liminality of genre, you know, is this real, is this fantastic in a way, is also kind of the transformations the characters are going through. You know, just a couple of examples. One character experiences a pretty severe breakup after a 20-year-old chinchilla dies, and leaves a city behind to move to the suburbs. There's also kind of a little bit of an element of horror thriller. One has a boyfriend who's microdosing his boyfriend with poison to keep him in the relationship. Well, he's also a perfumer. That's why I almost accidentally said perfume. And then, kind of things that are even more fantastic, where there's a coming of age story about a teenage boy who lives in a shopping mall, but the entire world is a shopping mall. So it's probably my most fantastic kind of surrealist piece, but sort of run the gamut, but lots of queer characters, queer scenarios, and just kind of queering genre too, in a way. So that's my story collection.
Thank you so much. So picking up on something that all of you have mentioned, and of course is the theme of this conference, what do you think makes something a work of literature queer? Is it necessarily, as Michael said, half of his stories are contain gay characters, the other half maybe more lean towards straight characters? Are those stories still queer to you, Michael? And what do the rest of you think about, you mentioned, being experimental. When I often think of autofiction, or like being as close to, your own experience as possible in fiction, in the style of Edmund White, like that's a very queer thing as well. It's like the opposite of being, using magic and magical elements, in my mind. So what do you think of as like what makes something queer? And what does it take to get into the section? I know at least a couple of us are old enough to remember when you had to go to a bookstore, you couldn't order online and you had to find the section where the book belonged, right? So
alternative
your book
aisles.
What's the aisles? Remember aisles? So would your book have been on the shelf in the queer studies? There used to be queer studies only, right? Would it have been in the queer studies section, or would it have been in the general fiction section? Mike, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, but first I have a question for you. Did you go to those sections of the bookstores? Were you looking for books there? I thought it was for cruising. Isn't that why we went to that section of, yeah, anyway. No, I'm a terrible person to talk about anything sort of theoretical, because I'm sort of, I think I'm sort of like purposefully dumb about my own work and about sort of the larger questions. I mean, part of me wants to say I'm queer, so anything I write is queer because that's the way I see the world. That's the lens, through which I look. And I'm always interested in other people's discussions of what counts as a queer sensibility, or what that means. And I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about like the Edmund White sort of autofiction and how that's a sort of a queer move to make. But I mean, I don't know. There have been different, as the culture has changed, it has seemed more or less important to embrace or repel the idea of being in the gay section, the queer section in a bookstore. And I remember desperately wanting to break out of that section maybe 20 years ago, and being, sort of everybody wanted to cross over, whatever that means. And now in a weird way, I wish I could reclaim more of being in the queer section. I'll try to keep this brief, but actually the first few drafts of the cover copy for this book that the publisher sent me made no mention of gayness, queerness, sexual orientation whatsoever. And even in the, like the little one-line synopses of the stories that they sometimes put on a story collection cover copy to sort of tease what some of the plots are like, those were all written in an entirely degendered way, so that you couldn't have any sense of whether there might be queerness. And I found myself really sort of upset. And, I wrote back to them and I said, I actually sort of did a revision of the copy, and I introduced the word queer, and they sent it back to me and that word had been deleted. And so then I had to write this long memo. I was like, there may be reasons for wanting to pitch this book to a wider audience, or, let people discover the queerness in it on their own, and the title is already put in your face, so maybe you're trying to like give people some comfort, whatever it is. There, I'm totally open to hearing those arguments, but I would actually like you to tell them to me, and not just sort of assume it, because to the extent that I might have anybody who's interested in my work over the past 20-25 years, it's been largely in the queer community, and so it would be a shame to sort of not tip those people off. Anyway, lo and behold, the next draft had a phrase about, a diversity of queer and straight characters or something like that. So, but I was sort of watching myself with interest, like how funny that you're now arguing to have this in, when 20 years ago I remember arguing that on the, the book where it says, it could either say just fiction or LGBT fiction. Or I remember arguing like, could you please just call it fiction? So it's strange. I would love to know what the other folks think about that.
Patrick.
Yeah, I think that for me, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more flexible as to how I think about myself and how I think about labels and genres and all of that, really. I think it's gotten much more flexible. So being 50 now, I think I have a different answer than I might have earlier in life. So when I first started writing, I wrote specifically to be queer in the queer sexual sense. So a lot of my first pieces, which were poems actually, in my early 20s, were actually, half of it was just sex, just, outright sex. And that was fun. And I went through that. And of course, that is very queer. But I think that as I've grown older and I've kind of done a lot of therapy, and figured myself out, I realized that I think I was queer before I actually realized I was gay. So that this idea of queerness started for me even earlier, being like 10 or 11 years old. The idea of being the outsider on the outskirts of things. And not only that, but within that, being this sort of creative person. And so I felt very at home with the idea of being queer, completely detached from what I associated with queer at the time, which would be something that you got called at the schoolyard, sort of thing. So I didn't think of myself then like that, but I knew I was an outsider. And so I think a lot of my work, even if I don't write gay, specifically gay fiction, I think that the work is inherently queer because those formative years for me, I think it's hard for me to get away from that. And so even the stuff that I write that's from a straight perspective is very much the outsider, the deformed, the diseased, the person on the outskirts, whatever it happens to be. That's what interests me, and that's where queerness for me resides, and that strangeness.
JD.
I mean, what Patrick just ended with, I think there is something there with queerness, both the old-fashioned sense that queer means strange, and there's some strangeness to it, but also there's sort of an expansiveness, right? I mean, queer sort of opens itself up in a way to multiple categorization or interpretation. I mean, I think there are things that really do matter, like representation. I mean, I have some stories in my book that are more slice of life, this is a gay couple, but then I have things where there's never really a mention of sexuality, but they're also very queer. I think part of that, it's almost like this undercurrent or subterranean quality. I mean, so much of sort of LGBT is like coded, right? There's so many small signals we send each other. So, I mean, I have a story that's like kind of a campy retelling of the crucifixion. And it's sort of this gem bunny character. And of course, I mean, I feel like if have this association with gayness, you'll probably be like, oh, okay, gay gym culture, this means something to me, and it might not mean something as much to a straight reader or something. And of course, also just the way that the dealing with the body, I feel like the way that queers experience their own body, that can be, I mean, of course, not universal, but subtle. So even though I have like a story that doesn't really deal with desire or sexual desire, I mean, I think it's a very queer retelling of the crucifixion. And I don't know what makes it. I mean, sometimes isn't that just kind of like the act of writing where you're sort of just like weirdly obsessed with something, whether it's like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know, the crucifixion, and I'm going to write about this, but you're not necessarily trying to make a meaning, but sometimes that just comes out. It's like this, it just like bleeds out, whether you're even purposeful. And I think that's kind of the beauty of writing fiction, is that, or even poetry, right, which goes hand in hand with the short story, is that there's this kind of undercurrent that can sort of be interpreted, even if you're not necessarily heavily handed trying to be like, this is what I'm trying to communicate to you, dear reader,
Yeah, I feel like with most writing projects, you start out with some things that are going to be there, and then the questions that you have to answer, right? So how does this impact, this is a panel on short fiction, but people who write short fiction often also write novels. Did you feel drawn to this genre in particular, or do you know when you start writing, like this is going to be a story, or maybe it'll be a novel, or this is going to be a novel, but then it turns into a story, or do you always know what kind of like container your work is going to have when you start writing?
So with it, so that we don't get into a pattern too
Yeah,
much.
let's mix it up. Let's start with
let somebody else start.
Patrick.
Oh yeah, sure, I can. Let's see. So for me, I think short stories have always been the base of my writing. You know, like I said earlier, I started with poetry way back when I was very young, in my early 20s, and then quickly moved to short fiction, and I've stayed there for many, many years, even though I have written novels that are kind of in different stages of being polished. But everything for me starts with the short story. So even the novels, I've actually, I have 3 novels that I've written. I know that they're not published now, but they're novels that are fully written, they're just not polished. And each one of those actually started from a short story. And I think that's the way I work as a writer, in that I begin with a moment. And I think a moment is specific to a short story in a lot of ways. You know, a novel can't be about a moment, but a short story can. And I think that it's all about how do we get to that moment? And that's what the short story is, at least for me, that's how I look at it. So it's very tied to memory, because a lot of what I do when we're talking about autofiction, a lot of what I do is I draw something from a memory in my past. And a memory is a moment. And so I think memory and short stories actually go really well together as well, because they are episodic. They're these little short contained pieces in our head. So I see a connection between all of those. And that's kind of how I work. So I pull something from memory, and then I kind of work with that as a lumpy piece of clay. But it then becomes something that the entire thing is made of. Yeah.
JD.
You know, I sort of started out writing poems before I experimented with stories. So maybe it was also like taking the training wheels off and sort of moving. But even at this point, I believe the short story is closer to the poem than the short story is closer to the novel. And I think in that way that a poem, like a short story, like Patrick said about the moment, and also things we're talking about like ecstasy and desire. And I think these sort of really intense emotional outbursts, that's like you can capture that in the moment of the story versus like, you know, the short story is the one night stand. The novel is like, we've been married for 40 years and he gave me a clock. Right. It's one of those things like you're in it for a long time. And there's like boring stuff that can happen in the middle of the novel and no one ever remembers it because it's all about that long journey. But the story, it's like that really intense, condensed moment. And I think that's what's kind of wonderful about it.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said. And you know, Alden, you were saying that when we start to write something, we have something that we know, and then the questions we need to figure out. And for me, I think stories are usually about one question, really, for me, or one moment. The way Patrick said, like I imagine a scenario or a choice that somebody has faced, and then I just want to build just enough to make that make sense. Right? Just enough so that the reader will understand why that's as important as I hope it is, you know? And so it's usually just sort of one question about one moment, scenario, whatever. And then for me, novels, so I've written 4 novels, and then this is my first story collection. So I've actually turned, although some of the stories were written, you know, long ago and in between novels, but more recently I have been writing shorter things, shorter essays and stories. And for me, a novel is sort of about just like an endless series of questions. And it's sort of like you create the superstructure of whatever it is in terms of character and plot and situation. And then you just start pelting questions at that superstructure, you know, and it's just a whole building accumulation of them. So I guess that's for me the difference. But, and I think I agree with what JD was saying about, you know, the short story being sort of closer to just the sort of the moment that you can address in a poem. Then, like, I see so little connection between the short story and the novel, to be honest. Like, even the longest story in my collection is, I think, about maybe 12,000 words, or like, 30, 40 pages. And, I guess that's inching toward novella territory, but it doesn't feel that way at all to me, because it's just, like I said, it's just, I mean, in that case, it just took me way too long to build up, to accrete all this stuff, as I was saying before, so that the thing that happens at the end, I hope, will be meaningful. But it's just a completely different beast, I think, than the novel, at least for me.
It's kind of like a movie set in a way where, I mean, like I have one novella in my book and someone's like, I could see this as a novel. And I'm like, I can't, because it's like, the more I extended it, it would like, you would see behind the curtain, it would fall apart. Like I only imagined it as long as this thing. And to be a novel, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about family relationships. And, it's, and the short story, it's almost like a fairy tale. Like it's like the trope, it's like the evil stepmother. You don't need to know birthdays or all these other things. It's this very flat sort of surface. And I think that flatness can be wonderful. But then I feel like if you try to force it to be this longer, three-dimensional novelistic thing, it'll start to fall apart.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like you have to have the idea has to fit the shape that you put it, the container that you put it in. So I know at least one or two of you have had the experience of writing your stories over many years and then collecting them. So first of all, what is it like to have something that you've just written out in the world versus something that you've written when you were maybe a different person? And also related, but kind of a separate question, when do you know you have a collection? Like if you're writing stories over the years, when do you stop and say, okay, wait, I have a book? And how do you just like, is it organized by length, by theme? Do you make changes once you've made that decision? Do you add stories? Like putting together your collection is something I'd love to hear about. So Michael, let's start with you, since I know that how many years did it take you to write all these stories?
I'm not sure I even want to admit that, but
yeah, don't admit it. Okay. It was a lot of years. Okay.
But a lot of years. So about half of them are recently written, and then half are quite old but revised. And yeah, I wrestled with that too. I mean, and I know sizes and everything, but I also, I already have like an inferiority complex. Like, should it have been longer? It's only 8 stories. But to me, stories are exhausting, not just to write, but to read as well. So like for me to read a relatively slim book with 8 stories takes 5 times the energy for me to read a novel. And so I guess I'm not too worried about inflicting that on, or I mean, maybe it's a relief I'm giving people, but I knew I wasn't going to be connecting it, linking it the way some story collections are, other than by theme. And so that helped though. So like, probably the most successful story I've written, in that it was anthologized 3 or 4 times or whatever, actually it has nothing about desire or sex. It's about a 13-year-old boy dealing with some family stuff and the Holocaust and whatnot. So I didn't include that. And then there were maybe 3 or 4 stories that were even older that were perfect for the theme, but I just couldn't make the me who wrote those, 25 years ago, I just couldn't match that up with the me now, both sort of mentally, but also in terms of craft, I guess. I mean, I would like to think that my writing is better. So, but it was interesting to go back to some of the older ones. When I heard from the editor that they wanted to go ahead and publish it, I suddenly panicked and looked at maybe 3 of the stories, and I was like, okay, if this is going to be out in the world, and so then I sent those to a dear, very critical friend who, whipped them into shape. And I mean, that was a fascinating experience. So like one story, probably it might be the oldest one, it was published in the Kenyon Review, which I think of as like a really good magazine. And at the time, it was like the pinnacle of my career that I got that story into the Kenyon Review. I mean, it really was. I can't believe I'm in the Kenyon Review, and this is the best achievement. And then these years looking back at it, I was like, and this is nothing against the Kenyon Review, and God bless them for publishing my story, but I was like, oh my God, this story has holes all through it. It's like Swiss cheese, and it just doesn't hold up. And so I had to, reconstruct things according to how I understand narrative now. So it was really challenging, and I have no idea how people will react to this book, if it will feel to them like a book, or whether it will be uneven, or I don't know, we'll see.
JD, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I love the idea of the Swiss cheese. That feels really familiar. And that's something too, where I think in terms of my editorial decision, it's almost like, right, like when you're a magician, like you don't want the audience to know how the trick is done. And I think that was part of my process, where some of my stories, I was like, oh, this is so transparent. It has the Swiss cheese holes. Like people are just gonna see through the tricks of this. But the ones that I picked out, I want to have some element of mystery or craft or poetic language in a way that I don't think that it's going to fully reveal itself to the reader. And I want there to be lingering questions. I mean, the oldest, I have 2 stories from 2009 and 2010, and then I really didn't write much fiction for years. And the other stories are from 2015, 16, 17. So it's a pretty, not a lot of time went in between sort of, sitting in the drawer. But I found almost a value in the 2009, 2010 stories, because they're also the only 2 third-person stories. So they kind of provide a variation to the beat. The rest are very first-person and voice-driven, which I guess was my obsession at the time. And I don't know if I will, where it's going to go, or, I don't know if I have enough distance yet to see how this holds up. But I think it was trying to find commonality between themes. And maybe that was a little bit easier for me because I'm definitely more of a poet than a novelist, and poets are used to like thumbtacking different sheets of paper up to the wall and being like, how do I order this poetry? Like, what is the order of this? And that felt more like tapping into a poetry skill set that I luckily felt familiar with the story collection. In terms of writing a novel, I'd be clueless, but the sort of accessing the poetry skills for trying to find thematic overlappings, it just kind of felt organic.
Patrick.
This collection specifically felt very natural to put together. So the stories, however, do span, this is showing my age, of course, but they span from the mid 90s till just a couple of years ago. So I happen to be a constant revisioner. So I do have those stories from the mid 90s, but of course, then I've tinkered with them along the way through the years. But the thing that really was easy with this was that I was approaching it, really looking at it the same way as James Joyce's Dubliners, because I was writing about New Orleans. And so it was the unifying aspect of the theme for the entire collection that was naturally there. So I could basically go through my short stories and just pick and choose which ones, felt right for that sort of direction of New Orleanians and how they live their lives. So the other thing I think is that there's such a big difference between when I was writing those first stories, which is half the collection, maybe 60% of the collection. The initial stories were written in the mid 90s. And this is the autofiction parts, when I happened to be in a relationship that was not a good relationship. So I was in an abusive relationship, emotionally and physically, for 8 years in the 90s. And those stories came out of that time period. And so I think at the time, they were very much cathartic for me. But now when I write, even if I write about that same period of time, it's very much from a more objective point of view. And so I think I experience it differently now because of that, because I'm not in that turmoil. So it's been interesting publishing this now, because I had to really closely revisit a lot of those stories that I hadn't looked at in many years, and to kind of be reminded of those years that weren't good, but that formed me as a writer. And the traumas of those years, kind of gifted me with something that I think that I see now, but of course I couldn't then.
Yeah, I wonder if, even if it was the exact same story, and I think this is probably the case for some of your work too, Michael. JD, yours all seems very recent to me. 2009 was like yesterday in my mind. The mid 90s are that's a couple of years ago. So when you like, say you've published a story, it's the exact same story that you wrote. Like, say you didn't edit it that much, people will receive it differently, right? So if you've written it and it's just happened and you're 25 and you're describing a 24-year-old, people will assume it's 100% autobiographical and that you're still emotionally in it, right? Whereas if you just hang on to it for 20 years and then publish it, it's read not as a 20-year-old story, but as a current story reflecting, where the author is reflecting on something that happened 20 years ago. So do you feel like it changes the way people read the work? I don't know if that might be a yes or no question, but
for as long, I think it's for as long as, I think that there's this difference between writers that we get to know and writers that we don't know anything about. Because I think there are situations where we read a book and we really don't know anything about that writer. So I think that's part of it. So if we can begin to kind of identify who the writer is, start saying, oh, this guy's 50 and he's writing about a 23-year-old, then those sorts of assumptions start being made.
Okay, so I have a related question to that. We live in the era of social media where writers are expected to Twitter and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, I make myself do it. I hate it. And it's like out into the ether. Nobody cares. I'm like, I've got to do it anyway. There's this expectation that we're, engaged socially as a person. And then, we look back at, the era of Flaubert, where Flaubert said, the writer should write and make posterity believed he never existed. So the person shouldn't be there. It should all be in the work. And he was famously like, didn't let people photograph him. So do you think that is, how does this relate to your work? Do you feel like you're in your work, or do you feel like you want people to just read your work and not make any assumptions about you? I think, especially with autofiction, when, if we ever use our real names, people, of course, are going to assume it's autobiographical, even when, if it says it's fiction, it's not, right? So how much expectation do you have that readers will conflate you, the person, with any of your work, or how present should an author be in his, her, or their work? And let's start this time with Patrick.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I think that my first thought immediately, the first thing that comes to mind is that because I think all of us in this group, at least, we're coming from a queer perspective, I think it becomes important for there to be also the personal as well as the work itself, so that the author tied to the work is important. And it becomes something where that is the visible as well. So, you're visible in the work if you're writing queer work, but if that queer work is not written by somebody who's queer, then is it still visibility? So I think that's important to have those two things tied together, where you have that representation and it carries over outside of the book into the artists themselves. And we have a responsibility politically, I think, in that way, but it's very natural. So the responsibility is just really the same as we have a responsibility of breathing. Just the fact that we're existing gives us that visibility, that if we're putting ourselves out there, this is a very, I think because I was in my 20s in the 90s, that I think it's a very 90s kind of way of looking at queer liberation and the queer world. Yeah.
JD.
I think I'm kind of going back to this idea of the magic trick, is that you're always sort of accruing layers. And I think there is an autofiction component to my work, often like an emotional truth. Like there's some emotional state of mind or truth in the moment, but the fictional process is what's wonderful, is I can change it. Like, I mentioned I have a story that's about a breakup and someone leaves a city behind to move to the suburbs. That is literally what I went through. I went through a breakup, and the breakup was part of me moving away from New York and moving back down south where I was raised. And there's an emotional truth there. So the voice of the narrator, that's absolutely me. But the catalyst in this story is this 20-year-old chinchilla dies, which was just this weird fact I read, that a chinchilla named Radar was, and maybe it was like 30, I don't know, maybe this chinchilla lived a long time. And suddenly I was just like reading about chinchillas and had this, that's the magic of fiction, right? Where you're like, God, what if this this pet was the only thing holding this relationship together, and the pet dies. So the catalyst of my relationship was I went back to go to grad school, and that's not really exciting. But the catalyst in the story is this beloved pet chinchilla dies, and this entire relationship falls apart. And I think that's kind of what's interesting about sort of fiction versus autofiction, is like you can sort of torque one component and make it fictional, even if like emotionally it's like true. But then, you know, a reader is like, people are like, have you? And I'm like, no, I've never had a pet chinchilla. You know, I went on Wikipedia, but I think, you know, I don't know if people, sometimes people read truth into it, but I don't know if I'm bothered by that. I mean, I do value privacy, and I also hate tweeting, but I think I'm sort of just like, I think once the work is out there, if people want to think it's auto fiction, I mean, that's, I don't know, that's interesting if you interpret that way. I mean, I can't be sitting next to you when you read the book, so you're like, this is absolutely JD's pet chinchilla. I mean, I don't know.
They're going to believe what they want.
I have such a whole range of different responses, and I love the question, Alden. And you know, on one level, just in terms of sort of public, private, not necessarily even how it relates to the work. You know, I think probably like many of us, there was a time when I was, you know, just starting out where I probably had sort of visions of grandeur. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to be, you know, the most recognizable writer in the world, and people would hang on your every word. And you know, we grew up in an era, or maybe we're slightly later than this, but you know, when like writers were people who would go on the talk shows. So Truman Capote and Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, whatever, Susan Sontag, you know, they're like public personalities. And there was part of the ambition of wanting to be a novelist or a short story writer was, you know, be that person. But now that I've come to be in my 50s and now the world has changed, the last thing I want is for anybody to have any idea who I am, what I really think, what I really say, how I really treat my friends and family. And so, you know, my friends know that I'm not on social media at all whatsoever. I don't have a Facebook account. I'm not on Twitter. I don't have Instagram. So, and it feels very, very comforting and necessary for me to just hide from all that shit. And then if I put a book out in the world, people can either take it or not. But then in terms of how it relates to the work, I mean, I wonder how that will be, you know, the characters who seem like they could be me, like a gay man of a certain age or of certain interests, are quite heavily fictionalized. Some of the, you know, there's a single mother character who is in some ways more autobiographical, or a character in her, another character in the story is more autobiographical. So I don't know, but I've been working a lot lately in nonfiction, sort of memoir, and I've really been wondering how that's going to. I've been trying to not consider this question. So Alden, I'm pissed at you because to write these essays, I sort of have to imagine that nobody will ever compare the real me that's coming through in these essays to the falsified, fictionalized version of me, because then they'll see, as JD was talking about before, they'll see the magic trick, they'll see the curtain, and they'll be able to judge, you know, why did I switch that? Why did I not? Although, I mean, like one of the essays, I published this one a couple of years ago, specifically is sort of about the real story behind one of my novels. And so then I'm like, why am I whisking away the curtain after spending so much time trying to build the curtain, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wrestling with it right now, and I have no idea how I'm going to end up.
I feel that's interesting, Michael. I feel like that's a new subgenre, is like nonfiction about how I wrote a piece of fiction, right? Like
Alex Chi, anyone?
Alex Chi, yeah. And it's you know, I feel like whenever I see the ads for Masterclass, I have this feeling of like, don't give away your magic, you know, like stop, all you famous like geniuses, please keep it close to your chest. I don't want to know how Annie Leibovitz makes a photograph. So
well, even in your new book, Alden, you talk about, you go through the whole thing about thinking you were writing a novel and then having this moment and turning it into the last short story that ended up being in your collection. And see, I'm a junkie for that. I loved finding that out about your process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the book that I just wrote that Michael's referencing is a craft book, but it takes a topic that I originally tried to write as short fiction, and it like didn't work in fiction. So I had to figure out how to tell it in a different way. So have you ever tried to take the same material and write it in different forms, like the exact same material, and tried to write it in like a poem and a story, or a story and a novel, or do you just know
I
when you have a
have.
certain subject matter that it's supposed to be this form?
See, I know that I've heard the other writers kind of talk about how they're very set. They know maybe perhaps what they're writing when they start. But for me, I think it's always been that way, where I have these. If I go back, like maybe three of the stories that are in the collection began as poems, and then I worked on them independently. Then from that point, so there was the split that happened. And then from that point on, I then worked on the short story some, and then I worked on the poetry as well. And so there's two different existences for them, where they both still exist, and they both deal with the same subject matter, but they approach it differently, and they approach it in different genres. And I think that I'm flexible that way. You know, I finish a short story, say like the one that's in the last story of the book. It's called The Tempest, and that story, when I was finished, the narrator who's in it just kept haunting me, and I was like, you know, there's more here. You could go with this and really make a novel out of it. And so that's what I did. So I try to be open to everything, so that I'm not really, you know, setting the boundaries right from the start.
Michael?
I don't think I've ever tried to do the exact same thing. I mean, I've taken sort of similar realms and gone in one direction or the other. Or so like now I've written a few of these essays that a little bit are about, the truth behind a subject that I fictionalize. But, so much of it for me is about the material stays the same, but as I get 10 years older and another 10 years older and another 10 years older, I see it differently. And so it becomes a different story to me, and I make different connections. So actually the thing that I've been working on right now, one of the very first things I published when I was probably about 24, it was just like a little 5-page essay about I'll keep it very brief, but sort of discovering that my grandfather had a son before he had my father, who was killed in the Holocaust, and I hadn't known anything about it. And I wasn't purposefully like making it short. It just was short. It was that's all it was. All I had was 5 pages. So now it's 25 years later, and I've got 100 pages. And that's still the same core. And the essay starts with another family member asking me for a copy of that old essay. But now all these other things connect, and I feel like, I don't know if anybody but me is ever going to be interested in this, but for me, I felt like I had to explain this and that and this and that to make that little piece in context have all the resonances that it does for me. So I guess that's the closest I've come to redoing it, although in both cases they're essay memoir.
I sometimes think maybe it is the non-fictional component that I want to expand. I mean, I don't do much memoir or personal essay, and I think that is kind of my interest in being a fiction writer, is you can kind of, going back to the talk of like Twitter and a public presence, I sort of value that privacy in a way. I did have an auto fiction piece, just a quick summary. When I was a child, I'm born and raised in Tampa, Florida, and I live in Tampa, Florida right now. When I was a child, my mom worked at this giant Christmas warehouse by the beach, and I have this sort of auto fiction piece. And my mom was obsessed with Christmas and built a Christmas tree in every room of our house. And those are the weird, like, I don't think I have like that many weird things, like, but those are those weird, true things from life that people like love. And, I sort of, and also it was next, the Christmas warehouse was next door to this office building where the Virgin Mary appeared on the glass. I don't know if anyone remembers that. It was in Clearwater, Florida in the 90s. And so it actually got shattered. And I have a whole autofiction piece about this. But then I sort of was like my mom's weird obsession with Christmas. And now I'm actually kind of slowly working on a novel about this, this kind of queer adult with his elderly mother, who is kind of this Disney Imagineer heiress in this McMansion, and she's building this Christmas like continuously building this Christmas world inside this McMansion. And that's fictionalized, but it's sort of this idea of spinning this one weird facet of my childhood that of how could you not obsess with when your like mom was obsessed with Christmas throughout your childhood, and then kind of, you know, spinning it into this larger than life thing that is fictional. And I think that's one of my only experiences, but I think it has to be something, right, where you're just like so obsessed with it and you can't get it off your mind that it grows. And I mean, what is the novel if not that space to just grow and grow that idea?
Yeah, that reminds me that Florida's queer as fuck because it's like so weird.
Florida's so weird.
It's such a weird place, but like not in a way that you can even start to describe, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So I want to hear a little bit about your engagement with your press. So historically, queer short stories are always small press, right? Books, sort of alternative presses. Did you seek out a particular press? What was your experience with the press that you worked with? And was it like a press with a queer bent or not? And how did that impact your engagement with your audience? Who wants to start? I feel like
I can start again if you'd like. My story is a little my story is a little bit different, probably because my book won the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction, which is done in Georgia by the University of Georgia Press. So it's a university press that runs the award. I don't know if they're particularly queer or not, but I do know that there have been other queer writers who have won the Flannery O'Connor Award. Really wonderful writers. And so I think for me, the initial being chosen, right? So because Roxane Gay was the judge, I think there was that attraction of queerness in our work between us that possibly had something to do with that. And so there's good fortune, of course, which always plays into publishing. You have to have a little bit of good fortune. And but otherwise, I think that the rest of the time, I think that the fact that it was a queer novel brought up a little bit of some questions here and there, you know, where things were like, oh, is that really what you meant? You know, sort of questions, or what does this mean? I've never heard this, you know, said this way before. So a lot of the editorial things that came up, it required conversations because my work does get very sexually queer, and they might not be used to publishing that sort of thing. So for me, I think that was the only thing really. And I think also because of their publicity departments, that they're usually focused on a very normal literary fiction sort of approach to things. A lot of their connections weren't in the lesbian and gay and queer communities. So it's a little bit harder to kind of get the book out there because it was coming from them. So I had to do a lot of the publicity, I think, a lot of the publicity work for it.
Patrick, I'm imagining the copy editor going through your book and suggesting, should we have a glossary in the back? You know, like what's video head cleaner? But I'm bad. I know.
Yeah, between the Creole and the sexual stuff, it was very hard to interpret.
Yeah. So in my case, it's also a university press, the University Press of Wisconsin, and they did my previous book, which was a novel, and so I had some connections there. Although they had long had a really sort of vigorous LGBT publishing program for maybe 20-25 years, really because of a particular editor who was there, who I know Alden also knows, and he retired maybe. And he was the one who acquired my previous book. And he retired maybe 2-3 years ago. And in fact, every single person but one at the entire press is new publicist, new sales manager, new director, new acquisitions editor, just every single person's new. So to be honest, I'm not sure they're particularly, doing LGBT work anymore in the same way, or I'm not sure they have those connections. So it's sort of funny how I was there because I was there, but now they've changed. So I don't know, but we'll see how it all goes.
That's interesting because they had, of all the university presses, the University of Wisconsin had by far the strongest queer list. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. JD?
I had a really similar journey to Patrick in terms of I entered a prize. It was through Lake Forest College, sort of north of Chicago. They had this prize called the Madeline P. Plonsker Emerging Writers Prize. I was the final winner. If this was a horror movie, I would be the final girl. It closed. You know, I met the funder, Plonsker, wonderful woman, but I think she just wanted to invest in other projects. Something I think there's, some choice you have when you enter something like a contest, especially with a judge and your familiarity. The judge for the Iron Shard was Lydia Yuknovich, and I was sort of familiar with her work as a queer writer, and certainly, the way that she uses the body or embodiment. So I sent like my crucifixion story, where it's like, certainly about the queer body, because it has an actual, it's campy, but it actually also has like a actual crucifixion scene. And it's like but something I didn't realize, I was like, because there's certain choices where you're like, oh my God, did I mess up by sending my weirdest story? I mean, I think we've all had that kind of moment, but as it turns out, I didn't realize this, is that the prize itself was for innovative writing. So they catered to like kind of weird stories. So I ended up winning, and part of it was like a writer's residency, that also with the book publication, but also very, so it was the final year, the prize shut down. I pretty much worked with one professor at a university press. So I really had to do all this heavy lifting last year to publicize my book. I sort of tried to pull every punch I could just to get it out in the world, because I mean, I worked with one editor, but there was really, and maybe just because of the history of being like, because, I think my book is certainly more mainstream than some of the books in the series. I think I was like the 10th winner, and there's certainly some very sort of experimental work. So I think maybe they're used to just kind of being like hands off and being like, these writers know what their own work is doing. So I mean, grammatical and proofreading, but they in terms of queer content or everything else, they were sort of all things go green light. And I was very fortunate for that in that regard.
Yes, it's a major accomplishment. All of you, I have to congratulate all of you for it's a major accomplishment to get a short story collection published these days. It's so much harder, because big presses aren't usually interested in them in the way that they used to be. So my last question for you, and we'll go JD, Patrick, Michael, is your recommendations of short story writers or short story collections that you would like to pass on.
Well, I have some sitting on my desk right here, so I can show you. I've been reading a lot by Brian Washington, a queer writer, a recent collection. Wild Milk by Sabrina Ora Mark, very sort of dreamy, sort of fabulous prose poetry book. And I've been revisiting Magic for Beginners by Kelly Link, who is a writer I adore and someone who sort of eschews genre in every direction, from horror to fantasy to literary to kind of poetic. So she's someone whose short stories I admire quite a lot.
So I'll just say very quickly that one of the people who really started me on short stories was Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So a lot of his short story collections are just wonderful with magic realism. You were talking about that, JD. But one second, because I have some right next to me.
Maybe I'll give one last plug too, is my friend, a lesbian writer, Samantha Cohen, has a book coming out.
Sorry.
I was just talking about the Flannery O'Connor winners who are queer. And so I just wanted to say, this is a great story collections. Laurie Oslin, The Bigness of the World. And this is Anne Rafe, The Jungle Around Us. And both of those are so fantastic.
And aren't they married?
Really good. They are together, isn't it crazy? And they both won separate years.
They're married. And Patrick, did anybody interesting blurb The Jungle Around Us?
Oh, geez.
Just curious.
Garth Greenwell did.
I thought I did too.
Wait, you're not on there. Wait.
Did I blurb Anne's other book?
It might be on the inside. I don't know.
No, they're great. Actually,
Yeah.
Laurie, I was going to mention, and I loved when she won the Flannery O'Connor Prize that year. I was actually a judge for the Penn Hemingway Award that year, and I was supporting her book to win. And I didn't quite convince the other judges, but I think we got her as runner-up, the honorable mention. A couple of recent ones I would mention. I've also been reading Brian Washington's book a lot, which is great.
Oh, yeah.
A collection called The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans, which I really love. Sadly, I'm sure you folks know, but Randall Keenan, the wonderful writer, died this year, way too young. And he just, as a new book was coming out called If I Had Two Wings. So I highly recommend that.
That is a really fantastic book. I read the entire thing. It's so good. I read it in like a few hours. It was so good. I had to just keep reading and keep reading. Big loss.
And JD, I think you mentioned one that I didn't quite hear.
Oh, and my friend Samantha Cohen, she has a new book. I think it's out this month or next month called Sarah Land. And it's a collection, but all the lesbian writer, but all the characters in the stories are named Sarah, which I think is kind of a brilliant concept. Different stories, but every single lead protagonist in each story is named Sarah, and it's called Sarah Land.
That's
Love
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. Everyone go buy JD and Patrick and Michael's books. They're all amazing. And as you know now, they're all amazing people.
And buy Alden's books too.
Yes.
So thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you live next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.